No, you pay.
Okay, so we're ready to start? Yeah. Hello, everybody in the room and online. Very lovely to have you with us today. My name is Jo Howard, and I'm the leader of the Participation, Inclusion and Social Change cluster here at IDS. And I'm really delighted to be with this panel today, which is a really wonderful opportunity to share both some of the work in our cluster with colleagues, new partners that we're working with in Paraguay. So from a cluster perspective, opening up pathways for change is at the heart of our participatory research and practice. And today we're particularly interested to learn more about how Fundacion Paraguaya and our cluster colleagues, Marina and Mieke, are building and testing theories around this, and particularly about whether, how, and for whom, and in what circumstances participatory interventions actually enable progressive change. So our cluster is beginning a partnership with Fundacion Paraguaya, who are the developers of the Poverty Stoplight. And this relationship has emerged over time. And two members of the organization have completed their PhDs here with supervised by members, by Marina and members of the cluster. And Martin Burt, the pioneer of Poverty Stoplight, launched his book here. And Poverty Stoplight, you'll hear more about from our colleagues, but it's a participatory approach to understanding and addressing poverty, that puts families living in poverty in charge of defining and diagnosing for themselves their own multidimensional poverty. And for Martin Burt, the premise is that when you own the problem, you own the solution. And we'll hear much more kind of unpacking of that in a bit. So in this seminar, we have two colleagues from Poverty Spotlight. One very happy to have with us here, Nancy Ramos, who's here in person, and her colleague, Katharine Hammler, who's joining us online. And together with two colleagues from the Participation Cluster, Marina and Mieke, who will share experiences about developing and using theories of change as part of evaluation research on participatory methodologies as development interventions and as a way of generating change. So very briefly, I'd like to introduce our panel today. Nancy Ramos is a manager at the Poverty Stoplight Methodology Department. She holds a postgraduate degree in social sciences by the Facultad Latinoamericana de Ciencias Sociales in Paraguay. Yeah. She has facilitated numerous participatory research exercises throughout Paraguay and has 11 years experience in designing and implementing research projects. Katharina, who I can now see online, holds a PhD in global development from Tulane University in the USA, and she's responsible for research and M&E in Fundacion Paraguaya. And she's facilitated, her work involves strengthening the methodology of the multi-dimensional poverty measurement tool, Poverty Stoplight, and continuously refining its processes. A big welcome to both of you. Thank you so much for joining us. And Marina is Research Fellow at IDS and has over 20 years experience working at the intersection of evaluation, participatory interventions, and research. And she's currently interested in combining theory-based and participatory evaluation methodologies in order to explore systemic and participatory interventions in different contexts and how they work in different contexts and for whom. And Mieke is also a research fellow in our cluster and is particularly interested in evaluating participatory action research approaches and deepening understanding of what happens when people start identifying and enacting their own solutions to their problems So a very close overlap between the work of Fundacion Paraguaya and the research interests of members of the cluster. And Mieke's been using as youth community-based participatory research with Aboriginal communities in Australia and is currently working on a large-scale action research project along with Marina to reduce the worst forms of child labour in Nepal and Bangladesh. So that is an introduction to the panel. So I'd like to now hand over to the first presentation. Is that going to be you, Nancy? Yeah.
Hello. Okay, I can. It's okay. It's okay.
It's fine.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Yeah, my name is Nancy. I'm from Paraguay. Yeah, today I am really happy for this opportunity to share with you about our work at Fundación Paraguaya. The first time I told to you shortly wait about the Fundación Paraguaya. Fundación Paraguaya was, sorry. Oh, sorry. Okay. Okay. Fundación. Okay. Yeah. Fundación Paraguaya works through 4 programs. The first, microfinance programs, second, self-sustainable school, in the third, entrepreneurial education, and finally, the poverty stoplight. This is the program on focus today about, I want to talk to you. Okay, what is the poverty stoplight? This is its definition you can find in the website of the Poverty Stoplight. The stoplight is a tool that seeks to activate the potential of family and community to lift themselves out of poverty using a technology platform. It offers a self-assessment survey and intervention model that enable people to develop practical solutions to overcome their specific needs. This is its definition, but the question is, what do we do with it? And today, I want to talk about the 4 steps or 4 phase, how we work during the implementation of Poverty Stoplight. The first step or phase, we define poverty with people. The second, people choose the living condition, and then with the choosing the living condition from the families, we have the dashboard of living conditions, and finally, people decide on the plan, on the action plan. Yeah, we define poverty with people. How we can do it this phase? This part, we create different kind participatory dynamics. For example, we use focus group or mapping of life or connective interviews. The goal in this phase is we told to the people or the poor families about what is the poverty in their context. What or how do you see the poor people or families, the poverty in their context, or how do you feel the poverty in their context? With this is information that obtained through this is exercise. This is dynamic, like participatory dynamics. We used to create indicators to measure poverty according the context of the families. And then with the indicators, the people can choose what level is their situation. Choose according the level. The question here is, what is the level more similar of the situation, their family situation? And then with this, after the choose its level, next, we had the dashboard of living condition. These dashboards provide or shows a lot of information for the families. With this information, the families can reflect. And the question here is, what is the most important for the family to solve? What indicators? With what indicator you can start the work? And then finally, after they choose the priority indicators for the family, next, please. Yeah, people decide on the action plan. This phase have two steps, the main step. In the first, we reflect to the family because we want to understand what is the causes of the poverty. In this time, we can find different or any answer, because the causes of poverty can be for example, for a problem in the intention, the behavior, the culture, or a structural problem. And then the second step in this phase is how we work from the problem. We find the causes of poverty and what we can do with this problem. This is the most complex part of the in the whole process of the Poverty Stoplight, because the answer is can be many ways. The poverty is have different kind of solution. The activities can be different ways. And now after this this process, or about this process, we have a different question. Any question? What are the questions? How does the reflection of the causes of poverty with poor people? How does participatory collaboration to identify this is opportunity for change occur? And what is the impact for this change? This is our question about the process to understand better ways and how we can work in the better way to the poor family. And now I want to give my post to my colleague Kathy Hammler, who continues the presentation, and she told about how we theorize about the poverty, the process of the Poverty Stoplight. Kathy?
Thank you so much, Nancy. Can everybody hear me?
Yeah, that's great.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So thanks again, Nancy. I briefly want to acknowledge and thank Nancy for doing this presentation in English. I think that was the first presentation that she did in English about the stoplight. And I'm very happy for all of us at the Fundacion. Okay, so after we've heard a little bit now about the stoplight in general, I want to briefly talk about what we've done so far trying to theorize our work. I tried to put together this little timeline on this aspect. It was actually also an interesting exercise for our side, for you all to understand where we're coming from and where we're trying to go. The stoplight was first created in the early 2000s, basically since 2009. We've started to use it within Fundacion Paraguaya, within its operations. What's important to know is that it emerged as a bottom-up tool. So it wasn't created on a desk of a researcher, so to speak. I'm trying to operationalize some theories, but rather the other way around. It really emerged out of necessities that we had in the field of having a tool that addresses multidimensional needs of Fundacion Paraguaya's clients. And in the following years, there were several theories and frameworks that were basically absorbed into the stoplight and integrated into the work. And those were theories and frameworks that, for one reason or another, the team at Fundacion Paraguaya came across and found to be useful for the field work with the tool. Those were frameworks such as the integral theory, such as the theory of positive influence. So here again, it wasn't, I would say, systematic search from an academic perspective on kind of the best suitable frameworks, but it was very much exploratory, bottom up, seeing what works and what really contributes something to the type of work that we want to be doing. And that started to change a little bit in the mid-2010s. So in 2015, the stoplight started an official scale-up strategy because there was a lot of feedback internationally that we got on the tool, and a lot of feedback, a lot of interest from organizations wanting to use the tool. So there was a need of formalizing a little bit more what we were doing. And kind of starting to work on more of an outward-facing conceptual work. The first step in that, around the years 2016, 2017, was to focus on strengthening the metric part. So Nancy talked briefly about about how participants in the tool self-assess their living situations across the 3 levels. So we first focused on that, like what is theoretically, what is it, what we want to achieve with that, and what is kind of the measurement theory behind that. So I put strengthening under quotation marks here because in the process we realized that, of course, what means strong or what means not strong is very much context dependent. In this first phase, at least, we focused a lot on conventional notions of robustness of indicators, such as trying to align it with the MPI, which emerged at that time as kind of a leading multidimensional poverty index. Couple of years later, around the years 2019, 2020, we started to focus on formalizing our theory of change. I'll talk about that in more detail in just a second. And some important challenges came out of that too, which we'll hear about in a second. And so we've since then tried to kind of grasp a little bit where we may want to refocus, and we're really excited to have started last year formally this collaboration with IDS, hoping like by way of focusing on theory-based evaluations and on a kind of conceptual approach from a little bit of a different perspective, that some of these challenges will be able to resolve. So the pathway is continuing. So what do I mean by formalizing our theory of change? Next slide. Yeah, we're here. Super. So basically, you're not supposed to really see in detail what's going on here. I just want to show you here a very short, like a small subset of the theories of change that we've created over time. Because in the early years, before we really tried to formalize our theory, basically in every context where we needed a theory of change, one was created based on the needs and the context of that specific need. So those were different papers, those were different projects, those were different studies. And we ended up with a lot of ideas, a lot of interesting ideas, a lot of reflection. but they didn't always, I would say, point in the same direction or focus on the same, like identify the same key aspects. So at some point we had to ask us what a theory of change actually is, and for who do we want to develop one. So that's the answer to that question may either seem completely obvious to some in the room, or some other people might be, well, of course, that's the big question that we all are trying to solve. For us, the question, I would say, still is that we don't quite know yet, in fact. So the way we approached it as we first tried to formalize the theory of change is that we put together an internal task force with people from the research side of things, from the fundraising department, some external people who have worked with the stoplight before and who know a lot about it. We've done a lot of consultations with various partners around the world who implement the theory of change. And we've come up with something that we think helps to understand the general working of the tool. The goal there was to have kind of a leading vision for all of our international partners implementing the stoplight. The big challenge, like the biggest challenge, I think, that came up in that process was a very strong tension between what do we want to be the main purpose of this theory of change? Do we want to create a theory based on what we think should work in the field, based on our understanding of the tool, based on additional evidence and research that had been done since the emergence of the Poverty Stoplight tool? Or do we rather want to focus our theory of change on things that are actually happening in the field? And we noticed that there was a pretty strong tension, especially because of the large scale up of the Poverty Stoplight. We were at this point working with, I think at the time it was around 20 and 30 partners in 20 or 30 countries around the world, each partner doing slightly different work, given the nature of the tool that is participatory and that tries to kind of really adapt itself to the local context. That meant a lot of variation that needed to be taken into account. What we in the end settled on was a relatively abstract theory that tries to explain the stoplight with a relatively general focus, with the challenge arising that when it comes to actually answering questions of how our partners should be doing things, we again have found ourselves struggling to give very specific answers. So with that, I want to point out some of the key challenges as we face them today. I tried to group them a little bit thematically, and I won't be able to go into detail here. That's just kind of to give a perspective a little bit on the things that we're currently trying to resolve. So I already mentioned one of the big challenges of do we want to theorize what is happening or what we would like to happen? We're still going back and forth between these. Because both have their merits, depending on, of course, the final purpose and question that you want to answer. I've mentioned previously on the timeline that we've integrated a lot of different theories and frameworks into the tool. So now we're faced with the challenge that we have somewhat of a patchwork of theories that have not been conceived together, that don't come from the same fields. So what do we do with all of these in a bigger conceptual framework? And again, do we want to use them to guide practice, or do we want to use them to explain change, which then kind of determines a little bit what you would want to focus on. Going to the other side here, we found kind of in the process of creating the theory of change, some blind spots in our framework where it matters most, and that is around what actually happens through participation and what are the aspects of participation that are key to the stoplight. So basically the theoretic and operative role of participation is something that we are still trying to grasp. We have good ideas or clear ideas for specific contexts, but trying to bring it on a more general level has been an ongoing challenge. And kind of on a more general level, wording kind of the same challenge, how to build an overarching theoretical framework for a bottom-up program has something that I think has defined kind of our struggles more or less from the beginning. And bringing these two sets of challenges together, I think a key question remains if there even can be one theory of change for all the purposes that we would like to have a theory of change for. We're really hoping that in the collaboration with IDS, we'll be able to come to terms with some of these challenges and find interesting answers. And with that, I want to pass the word on. Thank you so much.
Yeah, so over to IDS if you'd just like to answer those questions. Mieke. Thank you very much, Kathy.
This one? Is that, yeah? So I won't answer that question, but I can tell you what the process is for us to help answer those questions, which is what Marina and I will be very briefly talking about. I don't know.
It is on the online audience.
You can hear. Sorry. So we wanted to share a little bit of reflections on our positionality as evaluation researchers and how from that point we work with people and in organizations like Fundacion Paraguaya to theorize how participatory interventions work. And when I talk about us as evaluation researchers, the way that we position ourselves is that we are both academics who live in an academic world, but we're also evaluation practitioners who very much live in the practice of evaluation and see our role in synthesizing the knowledge and the evidence that comes from the evaluation work that we do, but also linking that to formal theory and formal published work. And on top of that, both Marina and I also very much identify as participatory action researchers, so very much also see the lived experience of people as a very essential element of knowledge, and that takes a center stage in the evidence on how participatory intervention works. So then how do we use all of that to build theory, to develop an understanding of how participatory interventions work? And we do that by using theory-based evaluation approaches, such as contribution analysis, which is an approach that you see on the slide here, which is a stepwise process that helps us, starting from a theory of change, to guide what kind of evidence we need to gather to build these theories. So it starts with identifying who are the different stakeholders in this process whose views should be taken into consideration. Then thinking about what is the attribution problem that we're trying to address. So what is the intervention and how that is contributing to what outcome, and specifying that. And developing a theory of change. So explaining how and why the intervention, how we think the intervention is going to produce the outcome. So how do we think participatory interventions produce the outcomes that we might see from that? And these theories of change are an important groundwork to then help us identify where we need to gather evidence. And at the start of the theory building process, we can look at where we already have existing evidence, either from the field or from formally published research, which we can then gather and then update theories of change and seek out and identify where we need to then shape our evaluation research to identify further evidence from the field. And what I forgot to mention here is that in the theory building process, that's also where the views of different stakeholders come in as well, and very much identifying how the people who implement or the people who develop the program see how the program might produce the outcomes that we're looking for. And then I wanted to very briefly, If you can just click, yeah, that's it.
Yeah.
So I wanted to really briefly illustrate with an example of another project that we're working on. The Clarissa project, which looks at reducing the worst forms of child labor in Nepal and Bangladesh by taking a participatory action research approach. And then this project, Marina and I have been working on using a contribution analysis approach to understand how, for whom, and in what circumstances participatory action research can generate innovative solutions to reduce the worst forms of child labor. And what we have been doing to theorize this in terms of bringing together different pieces of evidence and knowledge is firstly in developing our theories, bringing together the knowledge of the people who are developing the program, the experts in participatory interventions who work on the program, the people who are going to implement the program, and bringing their understanding of how participatory action research might work in the specific context of Nepal and Bangladesh. And then undertaking a realist literature review, so going into the literature to identify what other people have found in terms of how participatory intervention works, and bring that together with the views of the program developers and implementers to build a theory of how the intervention might work. And then we identified where we needed more evidence or information and focused our evaluation efforts on those gaps in the knowledge that we had. Which then led us to gather data during the intervention of the participatory action research processes. And in other moments where we brought together evidence from the ground and from the literature and the experiences of the people implementing the program was through processes of collective analysis, where we sat together and reflected on the data that we had, analyzed the data together, and the people who were implementing sharing their experiences of what changes they were seeing on the ground and why and how they think the participatory intervention contributed to that change. And that is an iterative process that we're currently still involved in. So it's the theory building is an iterative process where we're constantly bringing together knowledge that we're generating through the evaluation research, through what people are doing on the ground, and also updating that from the academic literature.
Thanks, Mieke. So yeah, back to this point about positionality, and who we are. And so as Mieke's sort of laid that out in terms of us sitting in between academic research and the practice of evaluation. The practice of evaluation and evaluation in the world is there to do something, right? It's there to generate knowledge, information, theory that can then be used in some way by somebody. So I want to draw attention, if we go back to the previous slide, to just phase 0, and you can't see it over here, but the last bit should say phase 3, which is evaluation use. So the original contribution analysis diagram didn't have those phases in it, right? So it's there to help us think about how we do evaluation. But actually, if you broaden out from the kind of technical process of doing evaluation and generating theory, there's actually the question of who's it for, which is one of the questions I think that you guys are asking, no? Is it one theory of change? Is it many? And who's it for? And what am I going to use it for? And those are actually some of the absolutely key moments in working in this kind of hybrid space. So if we go to the next slide, the way I think about that is to open up conversations right from the beginning about what is it that we value. Okay, so in evaluation, we're obsessed with validity. We're always talking about different forms of validity, right? And there are established frameworks, internal, external, construct validity, that are thrown around all the time, and that actually have very positivist orientations that are generally good for quant methods, are generally good for experimental designs, and that's not the space we're in, right? So if you don't have a conversation about, but what do we value and what does good look like from the beginning, recognizing that different stakeholders have different needs. A commissioner wants a certain type of evidence. A program implementer wants a different kind of information, right? And so how do you navigate those differences? So what I do in my practice is I open up that conversation about what we value. And what you see here on the screen is 6 criteria, which are based on a paper that Downs and Gullikson wrote, which actually identified 47 different ways in which validity is talked about. So the first thing to do is to bust the myth that there is only one way to think about validity, internal, external construct, and that's what we all do in evaluation, right? To illustrate, there are many different ways in which we can think about what is valid, what is robust, what is credible, and what is useful evidence. So this is an interpretation of those 47 into some key categories that are often discussed. I can't go into all of them, but I did want to zoom a little bit into transferability, because you might notice that that's a slight tweak on what is often talked about as generalizability, right? And Kathy's mentioned scaling, and she's mentioned that Fundacion Paraguaya started to reflect on what is the right theory for us when things took off, right? When people started to use the tool, where you had this more and more people using it, a demand for it, right? And no doubt a demand for evidence about how it works and what it achieves, right? And many commissioners and many donors think about this in terms of generalizability. What that means is that I can take the information that this evaluation generates about how this thing works, and I can replicate it, and I can roll it out in many different places. But as Kathy's also said, in each context that you apply this participatory methodology, it looks different, right? And we've been talking as a cluster over the last few days about methodologies that are meant to be working in context. So replicability and generalizability they're not useful for us, right? But transferability is a concept we can work with, because that's about how do you build rich understanding of how something works in context, such that when you share that theory, somebody can see the context as part of how the intervention works and can decide how much of that they can transfer or adapt to use in a different context. And that's what's often called a mid-range theory, which is the kind of program theories that we're using in Clarissa, yeah? And maybe if there's time in the discussion, you could say a bit more about what that actually looks like. But yeah, so then the final, if you can click once more, the final thing to say is that, so you can open up a discussion about what do we value? What are the criteria that we want to use to understand if the theory we're building is useful and to what end, right? And then you can turn those criteria into tools that you can use throughout the process and towards the end of the process to assess whether what you've produced is actually good. Yeah. So this is an example of a rubric that we're using in the Clarissa program, where we value participation. We're a child-centered program, and we want the evidence we produce or the theorizing we do to be based on that lived experience. So representativeness is an important criteria for us. So we would want to make sure, as we're going through the evaluation process, and indeed all of our research processes in Clarissa, that we have representative evidence through those processes. Yeah, and likewise, you could do that for all the other criteria, right? And I'm not suggesting everybody has to value this, but I am suggesting that in the context of participatory interventions and participatory methodologies, thinking about what criteria you value and using them as a way to help perhaps think about what kind of theory of change is useful, right? Because depending on which criteria for what use, you might actually develop something that looks a bit different. Yeah. I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Thank you to the panel. And Kathy, thank you for joining us from online. And we can now see you, which is wonderful. I hope you can see us. Good. So I'd like to open up for questions. After a tiny reflection of mine, I find it fascinating to think both about the theory of change that one person might have who engages in Poverty Stoplight and how you're supporting them to think through, so this is where I want to get to, how do I get there? And then the wider community around that project in place, in context, and then your organizational level, where you as Fundacion Paraguaya, you're trying to think through what is it that we're doing and how are we theorizing that, and then engaging again in a bigger kind of international or kind of yes, a cross-national and or global way with IDS, thinking about, so what are we doing in other contexts? So thank you so much for that. I think that's really rich. There is a question online that we could go to first from Nico, unless you're called Dorcas, they're both names in the chat. He asks, in which context can participatory interventions such as Poverty Stoplight be used? Does this include humanitarian contexts? Seeing as this has been quite a discussion that we've been having the last couple of days in the cluster, I think quite happy to see that question come up. So we could take a couple more questions. I'm sure both you and Kathy would like to think about that one. Kathy, yeah. That's for you apparently, Kathy. But have a think about it. So can you see the question, Kathy? Are there any other questions specifically about Poverty Stoplight that we can add at this stage? Okay, Danny.
When you showed us all the green and the orange and the red and the different choices that people could make through the tool, and it was very clear, and then in a sense you constructed those in a participatory way. Yes. And they're very you know, it's very easy to interpret them and people can take different directions from them, and I can see the participatory logic behind that. My question would be, can you change those, can you change the actual tool? Can you change the words in the tool as the process evolves, or does it stay the same from the beginning to the end? Can the tool itself evolve?
Okay, great. So let's turn to Kathy first to respond on, so can interventions such as Poverty Stoplight be used in humanitarian contexts? And to what extent is the tool able to evolve and adapt? If you'd like to go first, and then Nancy, we'd love to hear from you as well.
Yeah, I'll start with the second question first, because I think that's kind of a key part of the stoplight. So thanks for the questions. So yes, the tool can change, and the tool does change. The indicators themselves are adapted for each new context. So every time a new partner wants to use the tool, there is a process of adapting the indicators actually to make sure that they make sense through well, a large process that involves expert input, but that also involves some participatory work with people who will actually use the tool. Typically, I would say once an organization has adapted their tool and their language, they would stick with the same survey, though it also happens that even then, after a while, if something doesn't quite work, or if something evolves, the indicators might be changed to. Fundacion Paraguaya, for instance, the version that we use with our microfinance clients has changed, I think, like major changes like 3 times. Like we're in a version 3 of the indicators as of now. So yes, they do change. The first question about in which context the interventions can be used, I would actually be very interested in what Marina and Mieke have to say on that on a more general level for the stoplight itself. What I can say is that we are exploring the use of the tool in many different contexts, so that that includes some first experiences in the humanitarian context. Well, for instance, now in the case of Ukraine, but I would say our main experience is not necessarily in the humanitarian context. So we've been experimenting with it It's one of the theoretical questions that we are to a certain degree still also grasping with, because there's maybe good reason to believe that for a tool like this work, certain things have to be in place, both on the structural level and as far as like an initial like capacity within people. Where the question is to what extent can that be replicated easily in a crisis context. It's a field that I think will be very interesting to test out and explore more and learn more.
Thanks, Kathy. Nancy, would you like to add anything?
Only complement the answer. I can show after the presentation and how we can do the adaptation process and how we do the dynamic process, what kind the dynamic process we can use. And for example, we use different kind picture language that say Kathy. Yeah, this is adaptation. Can be has different number of indicators, and sometimes we have 15 indicators. In the other case, we have 30 indicators, depend on the context and what they say the people about the question.
So I'm wondering a bit about the the adaptability in during the process in a context. So yes, every context you would design differently, but once the process has started in a Paraguay or in a part of the country, can you then adapt as you find in this particular context, people think of poverty in a little bit of a different way, or as time passes, poverty is experienced in a different way? Are you then adaptive during the process of actually implementing it?
Generally, we adapted in the first step to start the process, and in the some case, after the 1 year's implementation, we have evaluation and we can change the indicators, the level indicators, or we delete indicators and or add indicators in the server.
Sure. Is that more? And that maybe is a
Well,
good
just wanted
link to
back the role of evaluation research in this as well, especially when we talk about context. So a big piece of what we're looking at when we talk about theorizing how interventions work is also how they work in a specific context and how the context and the intervention interplay to trigger certain what we call mechanisms, so ways that it changes people's mindsets in terms of how they feel about something or how they now understand something in a different way, and how that then might lead to, for example, behavior change. And if we're doing that kind of evaluation, I would really try to understand how the context and the intervention interact with each other. We can then, the information that we're getting from the evaluation research helps us to then also adapt the program as we're implementing the program. So it becomes an interplay between the evaluation and the implementation based on the context.
Just to briefly say that we were just grappling with this question in the context of a systemic action research methodology, which is another participatory methodology which we've been using, a number of us. And I think my starting point would be to say, let's try and see how it works in a context versus assuming it can or it can't, right? But the whole point about building these theories is to understand what it is about it that works, right? Is it that people are developing the indicators to begin with that's really important to the process working? Is it the way in which they then use the life plan and how that helps them to think about the root causes of poverty? And so it's actually a more causal approach that's working. Like, what is it about the methodology? And of course, that in Fundacion Paraguaya and many of the applications is not just on its own, but with microfinance programs or with other projects as well, right? So then it's interacting with other interventions as well. So in all of that complexity, the whole point of trying to do this evaluation research together is to ask that question and to then be able to understand maybe different types of contexts, right? Maybe a more collectivist society, it works in one way. Maybe in certain political situations, it works in another way. Maybe different levels of poverty or forms of poverty or types of crisis. And so starting to kind of unpack that. So one of the first things we did, Kathy, together, Mo, was to look at the many applications and think, what would be the typology? How would we start to design something that could help us answer this question?
Tenemos una comunidad donde implementamos el semáforo, donde tenemos como integrado una comunidad indígena y no indígena. Entonces, en una primera etapa implementamos unos únicos indicadores, pero después nos dimos cuenta de que los indicadores no funcionaban. We need to do different surveys para los indígenas y para la comunidad no indígena.
So Nancy was saying that they had one survey, one set of questions, one set of indicators for both an indigenous group of women, of people, and an indigenous group and a non-indigenous group. And they realized over time that actually they needed different indicators for the two groups.
Okay, Danny, I just have a couple of comments to read out. Laura has been commenting on whether or not you can adapt once you get started, and says that, so Laura Berg, does she work with Fundacion Paraguaya? Yes. Maybe you'd like to come in and speak, Laura, but I'll just, Laura, you say that we don't change the poverty survey in a country unless everyone in the movement agrees with the changes. So there needs to be kind of collective recognition or acceptance of that. Then she says we've developed different surveys for different themes, such as poverty, resilience, disability, teacher well-being. And if you adapt on the fly, you run into the problem of messing with the baseline. So you need to have a moment when you say, let's take stock. And then that links a little bit to Diana's question. She's asking how, and she's working in the context of Colombia, how have you analysed the actual changes in people's lives? And she's interested in how you measure transformation in poverty issues. That's quite a big question, and I may suggest that Diana gets in touch with you directly on the answer, but if you wanted to have any initial reflection. And Danny has a question, please. I'm sorry, I'm speaking.
Well, it's just a tension that I noticed, and in response in the comments around, like, you have to compare apples with apples, and that's linked to the baseline point. And so in a sense, your data requires you at some level to keep the same structure. But what I was thinking about is, if you take the picture that you showed us, and I'm just looking at the one that was up there about cooking, and it says, you know, poverty red, one of the indicators was that if you were reliant on wood and various other things, then you're in the red zone, you're poor. But if you were in a situation, for example, where the Ukraine war started happening and suddenly gas wasn't available, then the people who had access to wood could be the rich people. So there's something about how context is always changing, and sometimes quite radically. And how do you respond to that sort of change when the indicators are still the same?
The answer is context is always key.
But also the previous answer, which was that these aren't designed for very fast changing conflict contexts, that they are designed for some level of stability, but are still adaptable. But Marina.
Just a quick point about the baseline point. So I think, and just to clarify, I think there are, as you noted, several levels of theory of change going on, and there's also several levels of evaluation, if you like, going on. So the data you get from the stoplight as people evaluate themselves against those indicators is a form of data on conditions of poverty or multidimensional indicators of poverty. And of course, being able to track those over time is an interesting indicator that you've used in your evaluations in terms of seeing how those, how people's lives change. That's different to the way in which we evaluate how the intervention is working, right? So in our contribution analysis type evaluation approaches, we don't worry about baselines, right? Precisely because we understand that in each context, it will be done differently, yeah? And that there are so many, the kinds of outcomes we're looking at are around behavior change, they're around collective action, they're around things that are very difficult to baseline in a sort of easy survey sort of quant way. So just to distinguish those two forms of data that are being used.
Thank you. Any other questions? And I think we're due to end at 2, so we've got time for one really quick question or comment. I think perhaps a quick final comment from the panel would be nice. Starting with you, Kathy, online. Is there any final key point that you'd like to share or observation?
No, I'm very glad about all the comments and questions, and I mean, happy to reconnect afterwards to explore in more detail. I wish there was more time. Yeah.
Thank you. Anything you'd like to say?
Thank you so much for this opportunity. Yeah.
And thank you enormously for being here with us and for presenting in English. Thank you. Marina and Mieke, any final reflections?
So thank you, Nancy, and well done for presenting in English. That's good. And yeah, I am very excited about the collaboration that we're going to start with Fundacion Paraguaya. It's always really exciting to work with partners who want to do this kind of evaluation, and who are interested in not just whether or not our intervention works, but really dive into how and why it works. So I'm looking forward to working on that.
Yeah, same. Thank you very much, Kathy and Nancy, for being here. And looking forward to continuing the collaboration with Fundacion Paraguaya, which has been, there's various threads there. And just, Kathy, when you talked about your blind spots, I mean, I think that to me illustrates maybe what you're saying, which is an organization that's actually opening that question up and saying, actually, even though this is a highly successful intervention that has been scaled in many places, you're asking those questions, like what do we not understand? So yeah, really exciting. Thank you.
And I think that extends to us. I mean, as a cluster, I think we really appreciate and value the work that's going on that you guys are leading, and that your partnership is contributing to us thinking harder and recognizing our blind spot when it comes to evaluation of participatory processes and theorizing. So thank you all for that. Thanks everybody for coming.